Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the joint book release event that you are seeing streamed live from the Munich Documentation Centre for the History of National Socialism and the Bavarian American Academy at the Amerikahaus. And at the center of this book release event is the new book called 4 Years After: Ethnonationalism, Antisemitism, and Racism in Trump's America. To introduce and to discuss this brand new volume published by Winter Verlag Heidelberg in the book series of the Bavarian American Academy, I am joined here tonight by all of the editors of the volume. And I'm happy to briefly say hello. Good evening to Professor Noam Tadov, who is Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Innsbruck. Hi. And Professor Stefanie Schüler-Springorum, who is Director of the Center for Research on Antisemitism at the Technical University of Berlin. Good evening. And to Professor Miriam Tadov, who is the Director of the Munich Documentation Centre for the History of National Socialism in Munich. Good evening. And my name is Heike Paul, and I currently serve as the director of the BAA. So in what is upcoming, we will take turns introducing to you some of the themes and some of the voices in this volume before inviting all of you to join us for a discussion. And you can do that via the live chat or by sending us an email to the Amerikahaus, and your question will get to us immediately. So even as a publication of a book, and especially one that is the result of such a wonderful collaboration, it is usually a reason to celebrate. And the timeliness, however, of such topics as nationalism, anti-Semitism, and racism clearly is not a reason to celebrate. Instead, it is a reason for contextualization, for scrutiny, and for analysis. 4 years after, of course, refers to the Trump presidency, which is about to end. It ends because the majority of Americans overall, and according to the electoral vote, have elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the next president and vice president of the United States of America. And still, 70 million Americans have also cast their vote for Donald Trump, more even than in 2016. So this suggests that the problems that our volume address and that have become quite prominent within the last 4 years of the Trump presidency not only have been around much longer than President Trump, but they also will not go away anytime soon. And for that very reason, it is important to look at the present post-election moment, not as something akin to a happy ending of some sort, but as an occasion to keep in mind the longue durée narratives of ethno-nationalism, of anti-Semitism and racism in the United States and elsewhere. 4 years ago, right after Donald Trump had been elected to office, a very different book of retrospection was published. It was titled, "We Were 8 Years in Power, an American Tragedy." And it was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, an African-American intellectual and author, and someone we all appreciate and whose work we all know. The title had been a double innuendo of sorts, referring to 2016 and to the end of 2 Obama presidencies, as well as capturing the lament of Black politicians at the end of the 19th century. When Reconstruction ended, the Ku Klux Klan arose and white supremacist rule in the South flared up 8 years after the Civil War had ended. Now, following the Obama presidency, the election of Donald Trump also swept in a backlash of unforeseen proportions and of grave consequences for many Americans. Coates called Donald Trump somewhat provocatively the first white president. He is a white man, Coates writes, who would not be president were it not for this fact. And I think we all know what he had in mind. So in many ways, 4 years after, the book that we are launching today is a book about the meaning of this first white presidency of the United States and its side effects in times of a pandemic. And with this presidency coming to a close, it is time to reflect on its lasting legacy of racism and anti-Semitism in the political and perhaps even more dangerous in the cultural sphere as well. So in order to begin a more in-depth presentation of the topics and of all the contributions, I will now hand over to Miriam Zadov.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heike, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you for the collaboration between the four of us. It has been wonderful to work together and between our four institutions. And I want to start with a few words about how this project began. It actually started somewhat in November 2016, 4 years ago. I was then teaching at Indiana University together with Noam. And I remember the many situations when we were discussing with students what happened right now. And in Bloomington, in the Midwest, we felt the changes around the election very intensely. There were incidents of racism on campus, like on many American campuses. There were incidents of racism in schools, even in primary schools. And there was a lot of frustration and irritation, Black students who were full of fear and scared about the changes that they were facing. In this climate of racism, of irritation, students gathered together and they discussed what their role would be now. And some of the Jewish students in this specific class, they said, well, it's not about us. It's about racism. It's not about anti-Semitism. And we have to show solidarity now with everybody who feels attacked and scared, with the Muslim ban around the corner and international students suddenly feeling insecure, and so on. And then we started looking into, in this specific class, into American history. And we discovered that there was more anti-Semitism than many of the students were aware of. And of course, there's this story of American exceptionalism, and America was the country that saved Jews that fled the persecution in Nazi Germany, and played a very specific and very important role. And there were many Jewish professors in Midwest colleges, and their legacy was still felt. But nonetheless, there was suddenly a discussion about how racism and anti-Semitism are interconnected in the United States. And then we started this collaboration with the Center for Research on Antisemitism in Berlin with Stefanie Schüler-Springorum. And there was the idea of a joint conference, which then happened in the summer of 2017 in Berlin at the Indiana University European Gateway, with a very distinguished and interesting group of intellectuals from Israel, the United States, from Germany and Austria. This conference was the starting point for this book, and it was an interesting moment. It was in June 2017. It was 2 months before Charlotteville happened, when suddenly it was clear that the whole story was about anti-Semitism. It was in Charlottesville that white supremacists chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And soon after, there was the terror attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and eventually further attacks. And I just want to quote Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who at one point said, "Anti-Semitism is never ultimately about Jews. It is about a profound human failure to accept the fact that we are diverse and must create space for diversity if we are to preserve our humanity." Anti-Semitism and racism further unfolded during this presidency. But of course, it didn't all start with Donald Trump. Therefore, this volume combines historical analysis of the 20th century, looks into the 20th century, to the roots of anti-Semitism and racism, also further back, and what led to the current situation. In 2019, we continued this topic in the form of another collaboration between the center, between our center, the Documentation Centre for the History of National Socialism in Munich, and the Bavarian American Academy and the Amerikahaus, with a lecture series entitled This is America. And we invited Sarah Churchwell, Ibram Kendi, Roger Cohen, and Khalil Muhammad, and they contributed also to this volume. So this is how this, this larger collaboration started, and I'm very happy about it. And I want to thank also our colleagues Ilo Holzmeier and Margarete Schweiger-Wilhelm, who are here now but silent, and who have worked a lot that this could happen. I'm very happy that this book could be published, and it was actually published. And I have to say that now here again, it was published on election day. We received it on election day, which was basically a coincidence. We had planned it for that time, but that it really arrived on this day, and was of course a very emotional day for all of us and a very difficult week to come. And we are in a very difficult moment now with this presidency. And I think it's an interesting time, an interesting moment to look into history, to look into these various topics. And I want to hand over now to Noam to start the discussion on the contributions in this volume.
Hello, thank you. So in the recent article at The Atlantic magazine, the American journalist and writer George Packer quoted an observation made by the Jewish, German, Israeli historian and scholar Gershom Scholem that, and I quote, there are in history what you could call plastic hours, referring to the social and political atmosphere in Israel after the Six-Day War in 1967, in summer 1967. Scholem sought to describe the nature of turning points in history. A turning point, a plastic hour, a crossroad, in which the choices we make at the moment define the future course of events. Packer argues that we are now living in such an hour, which will be crucial to achieve or to mold the way that the future will look like. At the same time, we still lack at the moment the historical perspective to be able to evaluate these times in which we live. And we still have to wait a bit for that, things to cool down, for time to go by, before we could make a full account of what we are experiencing or have been experiencing in the past 4 years. Moreover, historical perspective is also dynamic, which makes it a bit problematic as well, or further problematic. What might seem to be a turning point, perhaps in 10 years from now, can reveal itself as a coherent continuation of processes that had begun before this plastic hour, and perhaps the forces of continuity would turn out over time to prevail the forces of change, or what seems to be a change. And an example for that is the Six-Day War that seemed to be 10 years at its 70s, it seemed to be still the greatest turning point in Israeli history. But now, as we see, Israeli historians and scholars are starting to argue that actually it was not such a turning point, but actually it is a continuation of ideologies that started before, in which the land, which was parted through the War of 1948, cannot be parted anymore. The same thing here. Our volume, 4 years after, which publication we today celebrate, is an attempt to provide a first account, an evaluation of the past 4 years. Not an account that will be close a discussion, but an account that should open a discussion, which should be changed the perspective and look differently at in the coming years. The historical analysis of the event points out the connection between events in similar moments at the past. That is, we look as historians at precedents to look for actually how the events or things that happened 4 years ago connect to similar phenomena that happened before. In that sense, we do also emphasize the forces of continuity when we describe this time. But at the same time, we underline the unique contribution of this period of time. That is the unique contribution of Trump to our, that is connection to other leaders around the world, and the influence that he had now over world politics, which is in many ways unique. And that, for example, is being shown in the volume through Ursula Prutsch's article on Bolsonaro and his connection to Trump. But to my mind, the realm that suffered most in the past 4 years and will be one of the major challenges for a future historian as they look back at this period of time between 1916 and 2020, between 2016, and 2020, is the change in the use and meaning of language in our time. Or if to be precise, the abuse and corruption of language in order to achieve political goals and to influence the masses through shifting meanings of words in order to incite, mock, and exclude different portions of society. The future historian, in her or his attempt to understand what we are now experiencing, will have to be an archaeologist of the sort. That is, she would have to dig through the piles of verbal debris in order to describe the events and to take off the dust from what she would like to achieve. I think that this, that is the misuse of language, is a central thread throughout most of our contribution in the volume, and it comes over and over in almost every one of the articles. It will have future consequences, and I would be more than delighted, or I would like to give a few examples for that, but not before Stephanie has said her words to you, Stephanie.
Well, thank you, Noam. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Heike. The first words I want to say are thank you to my friends and colleagues here and in the background. I think it was a very important endeavor for all of us, and Miriam has already described how it came about, and Noam has described its implications. So let me just be very brief on the implications from the German perspective from the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism. It might sound odd, but to publish a book called Anti-Semitism and Racism is not something that comes naturally, at least not in Germany. And if most of us and most of our listeners maybe, hopefully, are still aware of the debate on Achille Mbembe, which happened in Germany, which was a hot debate in Germany in the summer, and which made it clear once more how contested politically and also academically these two terms are. I mean, some people would say that, you know, anti-Semitism is completely different from racism, and you shouldn't even compare it. You shouldn't, you know, put them in a title. And while others would say, no, they belong together, and actually anti-Semitism is just a subform of racism, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in my eyes, it's somehow ironic that it took Donald Trump to make us be able or encourage us to think a little bit more dialectically and to come out in the open with a book in this dialectical mode, because obviously these two terms, and Miriam has mentioned it already, are entangled, and obviously they are also different. Just to be very brief on that, and I think it's good for, you know, when we talk about the contributions later on. I mean, of course, anti-Semitism and racism are forms of a hierarchical order of society, are means to construct a hierarchical order and to put human beings in this hierarchy and to put them like in a lower place than where oneself is, who is doing this. But in my eyes, at least, anti-Semitism has some important, you know, presents some important differences which go back to its religious roots from the, like what one could say, from the competition of the monotheistic religions, which means that in the late antiquity even, but in the Middle Ages, prominently, like, there was evil in the world, which was called the devil, but its agent were the Jews. So you have, from that time on, you have a religious, I mean, this religiously based hostility, to be polite, actually, I think makes it very special, and it links up with what then and now we can call conspiracy fantasies, conspiracy narratives, which are, and I think we all know this from today's manifestations in Berlin, which are extremely contemporary, and I would never have thought that I would be able to, or would have to watch plain medieval fantasies in Berlin 2020. So having said that, I think in this book, we are putting the emphasis on the entanglement. And I think this is very important because only the entanglement explains the extreme social, cultural, and political dynamic of these forms of hostility. And this is anti-Semitism and colonial racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism, but also homophobia, also anti-feminism, all kinds of, as I said, social and cultural forms of hostility. So, and what it means when I say dynamic, I think this became very clear in the Trump years, because it was not on discourse. When we know a lot about discourse, and we can talk ages about discourse, but here we had it praxis, here we had it in the streets. And I think in that sense, it was important to look back into, American history and also in its global entanglements to understand also the danger of this dynamic, I would say. And as Miriam and Heike said, it's still with us today. Thank you.
Okay, so
yeah, may I just pick it up just very quickly before we continue talking about the various contributions. I think it's very important what Stephanie just mentioned here. There was I had a brief interview with the Bayerische Rundfunk this morning, and Joanna Ortmann asked me whether it was a daring step to bring those two topics together. And yes, academically, it's a daring step, but the Trump presidency, I think, has taught us how important it is to think about these two phenomena together. And that was the experience, I think, with our collaboration also, that we started by worrying about an interconnectedness that happened with these rapid changes beginning in November 2016, and how it then unfolded, and that it unfolded in so many ways, and in the phenomenon of white supremacy, of conspiracy myths that are being cultivated, not only in America, but they're being brought to Europe, and they are sort of growing in their own way, and in our sort of problematic spheres here, like QAnon, or what happened today, for example, in the Deutsche Bundestag around this comparison between the new legislation passed on the COVID situation here, and a comparison with Nazi Germany. And I think one of the things that is really present in this volume and comes up over and over again is also the relevance of what we call memory culture, the way we talk about the past here, especially in Germany and in Austria. For example, Dirk Rupnow works on this topic, and we see the many implications, the way that reflecting on National Socialism has impacted also reflections on racism. For example, Heike, you've mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates. He wrote this very influential article on reparations for Black Americans for slavery, because reparations were usually paid for slaveholders, but not for the slaves. Those are really, I think, important connections, and there is a transatlantic dialogue that in a way also started with this conference, or maybe not started, but was sort of broadened. And I think that that was one of the very interesting experiences about these various topics that were brought together here, and authors with very different perspectives on American history, and partly also bringing in other histories, like, for example, Austrian or Brazilian.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for the disciplinary scope of the contributions. As you mentioned, many historians have contributed, people who are in Latin American studies, who are in American studies, writers, fiction writers, essayists. So I think that there is different kinds of expertise are trying to give their analysis. And I think important is also the idea of entanglement, so that it's not really to say, well, this is like this. I think that none of the contributions really makes any schematic or easy simplifications or analogies. And I think that's also important to see, that it's really about making a precise argument. Where is the similarity and where does it end? And how can we really take into account the different facets of whatever it is we are looking at in terms of racist scenarios, anti-Semitic protests, and so forth. So I think that's also important to keep in mind, that many of the contributions actually work through also false claims of analogy. For instance, when Linda Gordon tries to assess really what is the analogy, or what is the common ground between fascism and the Ku Klux Klan. And there is some, but there is also, there are vastly different ideologies at work. Yeah. Okay, so Noam, would you like to
Thank you.
pick out an article?
I could take it from here, yeah. When we talk about, on one of the things that is interesting about this volume, I think, is the fact that that many of the articles have threads that are somehow connecting them together in many different ways. That is, we could see a geographical connection, and we could see very often connection according with to ideas, to the examples from the past. But I chose to talk about 3 articles, which I think that are really connected through, where this issue of language I talked about earlier comes really forth and is really discernible. And I would like to, and those are the article of Carmen Lugo and Mary Blodsworth Lugo, that is dealing with verbal characterization of immigrants. The article of Richard Frankel, which also compares between 2 different types of strangers that are coming and depicting them as a threat. And the third one is the short, but I think very full of detail and emotion contribution of Valeria Luiselli, which adds a different character or a different scope to the academic discussion that had been, that is until this moment characterizes the book. So Carmen Lugo and Mary Blodsworth Lugo article deals with those verbal characterization of immigrants and asylum seekers in Mexico and Central America as a contagious disease. In a way, you could see through the article how this treatment is actually coming or emerging from the strongest person in this country, that is from Donald Trump himself. And already in the presidential campaign, they quote one of his speeches where he's saying, tremendous infectious, and I'm quoting, tremendous infectious diseases pouring across the border. The United States has become a dumping ground for Mexico and in fact for many other parts of the world. But at the end of quote. But yet Trump's statement, as Lugo and Blodsworth Lugo show, were not new at all. That is, he brought something new, or he's putting in new context old material, and leaning on a long tradition regarding immigrants as disease bringers, which were rooted in the 19th century America, but the tendencies at the same time of continuity receive always new meanings. And I quote Lugo and Bloodworth Lugo, politicians and public figures have the power to trigger notions of crisis by using the sensibilities of a particular moment to weave together fears, anxiety, and widespread ideas about particular groups in sound bites that resonate with the general public. The same in Richard Frankel's article or contribution, where he analyzes the very same topic and is pointing out similarity in the racist attitude toward Chinese and Jewish immigrants in 19th century, reminding us again, Europe, Germany, and America, remind us again the power of language and verbal tropes in defining the threatening other. Like with immigrants from Central America, also here, the semantic field of the descriptions is a medical one. Both Chinese Jews and immigrants were described as dirty and disease-ridden. Jews in Germany were described this way, and Chinese in the USA. And striking is the other similarity that Frankel points out, in which Chinese and Jews have the same attitude or towards money. And I quote from his article, I quote a passage from his article. Descriptions of Chinese and Jews in the United States bore remarkable similarity to those in Germany. Terms like rapacious and unscrupulous, thirsty and greedy, superior in business to the Gentile, were common in describing the economic role of Chinese and Jews. Frankel ends his article, at the end of the article, with an actual example which comes directly from this verbal world in which Trump calls the corona pandemic a Kong flu, in which by that he's practically, in those two words, is practically, I think, summing up our book together. That is, everything we want to write about the connection between racism and anti-Semitism in that sense, as being shown through Frankel's article, is being emphasized there. And the last example is from Valeria Luiselli's contribution, which was published in the New York Times before, and it was like a testimony of being an immigrant Mexican in America, in New York, under Trump, and the feelings that the events had aroused in the heart of her daughter, wanting not to talk Spanish anymore on the street in order not to be identified with this language that was rioting out there on the streets, describing immigrants, Latin immigrants, as a threat. Yet, Luiselli says, and I quote, "Not even halfway into Trump administration, we have witnessed a hate campaign against the dreamer generation, usually articulated in an aggressive law and order discourse that criminalized young undocumented Americans, undocumented who originated from children mostly, who originated from Central America. And since children are the future, we still have to see, or this is our job now, to wait and see how this period of time of verbal abuse will influence their own world as they grow, which is in many ways, or they are in many ways, our collective future." As those articles show, I think, they show very well the way that maybe turning points or plastic moments of history behave, in which they actually cannot decide, or I could not, the forces of continuity and of change are entangled with each other and work together. And I think in many ways they are inseparable. So there is no way really to talk about an absolute plastic moment at the moment, but always you have to wait and see where it develops, and it remains plastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for pointing to these particular essays in the volume. Yeah, as they share this concern with the demonization of difference under the arc of a virus or a pandemic, and actually sort of writing against that kind of discourse on the part of Valeria Luiselli, who does it also, I would agree with you, quite successfully. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think I could just continue here and talk a little bit about Khalil Muhammad's contribution to our volume. He came to the conference in Berlin and talked about many issues. He has written a now really important book. He was important already when he came out, but this year I think it was read and discussed a lot because it talks about police violence against Black Americans and the importance of looking into that as a historical tradition, not something that is so new. But Khalil's contribution to the volume is a conversation that I had with him in June via Zoom. It was in the middle of the George Floyd protests. And he was very, I think in many ways, he was very involved in this discourse, also emotionally. And one of the things that came up in this exchange, and I think this was something that really connects with the other 3 articles, was whether the question whether COVID-19 is a social virus in the United States, here as well, but in the United States very much so, because a lot of minorities have been affected as part of this phenomenon, that people who are working in more exposed and vulnerable jobs, people who are more on the poor side of society are more affected. New Yorkers could leave the city and isolate themselves in their hideaways in Western Massachusetts, whereas the people who had to remain in Brooklyn and other parts of the cities were really affected in a different way. And also there were the first studies released that would say that, for example, Black Americans, for them, the virus is more fatal than for others. Now, this week we have seen a different development, that the virus is now more in Republican states, also in the Midwest, in the northern parts of the country, and people are being affected who didn't believe in the fact that there is a pandemic because they believe their president. And their nurses describing moments in hospitals, people are dying, and until the last moment don't believe that they are dying of this pandemic, because for them it just doesn't exist, because it will miraculously go away. They believe that. And it's a very tragic, I think it's a very tragic development to see that, to see these social implications, the political implications in the pandemic. And this is something that that was part of this exchange with Khalil Muhammad, which also focused on other issues, like, for example, the relevance of German memorial culture in a transatlantic context, also the idea of future collaborations in this transatlantic context, which I think are really important. We've seen how many people have watched the election here, who've been awake all night during election week. I think never Germans, or I don't know, people all over the world have been taking part in an American election like this time, because of course it has implications for all of us. It has implications for the political culture in all over the world. And Obama has said it in his biography that just came out, that you cannot build a democracy and you cannot maintain a democracy on lies. It's just not possible. And so what we're experiencing now, today I've just read an article by Michael Brenner, who is teaching here in Munich, but also in Washington, in the foreword, and he's referring to this comparison between Trump and the Nazis that was made by a CNN journalist. And although he says, yes, she apologized and you cannot compare, and history is not about comparison, but history is about context, and history does not repeat itself, but history does rhyme. And then he suggests that what we're experiencing right now with the claim that the election was rigged and there was widespread voter fraud, not only by Trump, but also by the Republican Party, he talks about a modern stab in the back myth that happened right after World War I and had major implications on politics during the Weimar Republic. And I think it's another suggestion how important it is to have this transatlantic academic exchange right now, and also to look into history to get some sort of context and maybe some guidance in order to understand what is going on in the world right now.
Yeah, I think this was the word for me, look into history. I think, to be honest, I was again, when today I reread some of the articles in order to present them here, I was a bit stunned. I mean, I read them like maybe half a year ago, and now with the new situation, you read it in a different way. And I'm referring to the article that Heike already mentioned by Linda Gordon, who writes about the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan, which, as some of you or most of you might know, is after World War I precisely, and which is quite different from the first Ku Klux Klan, which was terrorist, anti-Black and violent, and which we all know by the images of lynching, etc. And the second Ku Klux Klan is much less known. It was dominantly in the north, not in the southern states. And it was basically anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. And again, we have this entanglement. It was against immigration in general, but it was very, prone to conspiracy fantasies. And it was funny to read that they had the idea that it was the Pope who was behind the immigration of Catholics in order to subvert Protestant America, and of course the elders of Zion who were sending the Jews. So we have conspiracy talk on both sides, but in the end, when you looked at the plans that the Klan members would have for immigrants, I mean, first of all, the first plan was to prevent them, but when they are already, those who are already in the country, Christians could convert. I mean, if a Greek Orthodox or Italian Catholic or an Irish would convert, then it would be fine. While the Jews were seen as a race, and that racism comes in, and they cannot convert. And so what I found especially striking and also worrying, if we look at the contemporary situation, was that the second Klan was at the same time middle class, respectable, very Christian, fundamentalist, of course, and was basically mainstream. They were not violent, but they went the election ways, and they were very successful. I mean, they were successfully pushing the anti-immigration law in 1924, but they also were winning senators, like congressmen, all over the place, governors. So it was a successful movement, which kind of ended, of course, with the Second World War, came to an end as far as mobilization is concerned, but then, of course, rose again, and this is the topic of Christoph Kerl's article in the book about white supremacists in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But it rose again, and with a different angle. While I think the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan, what Linda Gordon describes, is a movement that is defending one's own country against immigration. And in the 1970s, the situation has changed. Suddenly, it's a multicultural society, a heterogeneous society, And those people feel threatened from within, not from abroad, but from within. And I think that makes for a really important change. And again, we have this entanglement of being anti-Black and anti-Jewish, but it's the Jews who are the intelligent ones, who are calling for civil liberties, who are calling for social equality, for multiculturalism, and bringing, pushing the Black population in important position. I mean, that's a fantasy. I'm talking here about the fantasy of white supremacists, and this idea they call minority racism, which is something we can find today, and we find today in the alt-right, but we also can see in Germany, this feeling we are on the defensive. There's anti-German racism. We have to defend ourselves. We are the victims. We are getting overthrown, which is, and of course, Miriam, you are right, and Michael Brenner is right. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and this rhymes very much when with things that were said and felt in the 1920s. And in that sense, and one last thought I had when rereading this today, what is striking as well, but this is maybe a different discussion, one of the reasons given for this kind of feeling of being overpowered and overthrown is always called crisis of masculinity. And we have crisis of masculinity after the French Revolution. We have it after, we have it in late 19th century. We have it before the First World War and after the First World War and after the Second, and now again. And I think I really wondered whether this is, it always makes sense, but what does it say about masculinity in the first place? Doesn't it basically say that, okay, basically these patriarchal societies are governed by men, which are somehow threatened by other groups in society, and then they see it as a personal attack to their masculinity, while basically it's an attack to their social position. But this is just a reflection, like a postscriptum to the really wonderful articles by Linda Gordon and Christoph Kerl.
I think we've heard a lot about the gender gap also in the recent election, right? I think I saw some statistics that indicate that Trump would have been the winner of this election if women would not have been allowed to vote, and on the verge of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. That seemed a quite timely observation to make. So we are still facing this gender gap, and I think also that when we look at some of the arguments in the book, we can see the paradoxes of the ideologies that we are struggling with today, that use, on the one hand, very essentialist categories. So what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be American? And on the other hand, the way that they work these categories paradoxically shows them to be quite elastic and quite flexible. And I'm thinking, for instance, of Axel Germanas's contribution about the transnational networks of white supremacists who, on the one hand, are hyper-national in their self-fashioning, and they, in the US, are, of course, very pro-Trump and America first. But when you follow them around, you can see how, in fact, nationalism is more about whiteness as a category than it is about nation, and that whiteness, this whiteness in peril that you refer to, Stephanie, also as this fear of being robbed of a certain kind of privilege, then prompts all kinds of transnational global alliances that then develop their own identity politics and their own sort of cultures, if you will. Axel Germanas looks at the white power music as one sort of cultural venue in which we see those transnational networks unfold. And it is, in fact, global, also in terms of the moments where we see these manifestations erupt. And I think Charlotteville has been mentioned, but and Pittsburgh as well. But I think we also think of Halle, and we also think of Christchurch, and we think of many other places where this ideology is played out. So I think, I think it's interesting to take to task these ideologies in their very own paradoxical structures.
Yeah, and there is this really close connection between white supremacists around the globe, from Christchurch to Halle, and now to a growing number of people believing in the myth that are being sort of laid out and discussed in QAnon here in Germany. I think this is one of the things, one of the observations that we're making here, that there has been a very drastic shift also in the last 4 years, and an encouragement for these groups all over the globe. And then on the other hand, there is a different, I think there are also different types of white men, as we have seen now with Joe Biden. There is also, we've discussed a lot sort of the angry white man over the past 4 years, and now we have a different image also of white men here, and that there are different kinds of coalitions. And I'm very happy that we also have Roger Cohen in the volume, who for the New York Times, he writes a column for the New York Times since 12 years, and in the past 4 years was one of the most dedicated Trump critics, and he has written much less about foreign policy than he did before, and a lot about Trump. And he contributed a keynote address in Berlin in 2017 to our conference, and wrote a new introduction now this summer. And his text sort of spans the whole Trump presidency over 4 years. In his keynote address, he was talking on a very personal level as a British, South American Jew, and at the same time naturalized American. And he talked about what America meant for so many people of his generation and of other generation. This image that is starting to fade. We're seeing now that there are less international students applying to go to American universities. It's of course also due to the pandemic, but it's also due to a changing character of the United States, because people are afraid that their visas will not be extended. The overall policy towards people who are not American is a different one. And there are people who are disillusioned, and people who ask themselves whether it all has been a myth and what has changed here. And he's one of those people who has written extensively about it. And his keynote address, with its dire predictions, is in a way a historical document in itself, and kind of chilling in its prophetic quality, and in the fact that reality actually surpasses his worst predictions. So last week, in his penultimate column for the New York Times, Cohen warned of the imminent threat for the American democracy right now in this very moment. And I think we are all experiencing that. And it's really interesting to look at these various contributions in this context.
Can I just jump in just very shortly? Because I think it's important what we've been saying. And actually, Cohen, when he was in Berlin, he said we might not have elections in 2020. So at least he was not prophetic in that. But what I wanted to say is that this disillusionment that you describe with the United States of America as a symbol for opportunity and freedom and democracy and human rights, etc., I think this is a very wide disillusionment. Because from a Latin American perspective, this is something I would know, and I cannot speak for Black Americans, of course. I think this has never been there, or at least not in the last 50 years. If you look at US American imperialism in Latin America, and of course in other places of the world. So I think what is happening, and which is the good about this moment, is that these perspectives are coming closer together and talk to each other. And I think this is something very positive in all these still, I would also say, still very difficult times and threatening moments.
So we have experienced 4 years of transatlantic disenchantment. maybe more so than previously. And I also want to reiterate that I think that one of the areas in which the sort of the damage to both practical and sort of idealistic fantasies of in America that would be a kind of would have a positive image for people across the Atlantic, of course, is the chunking away at the immigrant narrative. I think that's where Trump has been extremely successful. On the one hand, by criminalizing potential immigrants, legal or illegally, but on the other hand, also in sort of trying to destroy all the symbols that sort of are gathered around the immigrant narrative. And I remember when one of his advisors, Stephen Miller, suggested to take off the Emma Lazarus poem of the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, you know. And so what does that mean? You know, of course, Emma Lazarus was a Jewish American radical poet. Yeah, so everything came together here for me. So the ethno-nationalism, the anti-Semitism, and really the destruction of a core myth of American society to see itself also, among many other things, as an immigrant society. And of course, that is something that is hurting the image of the United States in so many ways within sort of a globalized, even if you look at the market, globalized market economy and so forth. Yeah. Yeah. So we have already addressed many of the essays in the volume. I think we cannot address all of the 13 texts, but I think we are prepared to maybe single out a few that speak to one of the three concepts in the title of the book. One of the essays that Noam briefly mentioned in the beginning is another also comparative perspective by Ursula Prutsch, who talks about Bolsonaro as the Trump of the tropics, also as someone who fashions himself in the same vein of authoritarian populism. And we will see if he will also follow the fate of his northern neighbor. But I think Prutsch's essay is also very important in terms of the strengthening of authoritarian populisms in the US, but also abroad. And I think the European perspective would add to that observation that we have a global phenomenon in the West and beyond that sees people rise to positions of power with means that we would deem or even anti-democratic at this point.
Yeah, there is another comparative essay by Dirk Rupner who talks about Holocaust remembrance in the Austrian context and in the Trump context, which I think it's really important because, of course, Holocaust remembrance was an ambivalent topic for the Trump administration. On one hand, he wanted to try and show that he would take it seriously, but then they missed almost every opportunity to prove that this was not just a superficial way of dealing with it, and there were generalizations that were vastly problematic. And I remember when Trump came to Yad Vashem, he wrote in the guest book that he was so happy to have been there with all his friends. And I don't remember the exact phrase, but it was something in the line of, "I had so much fun. It was so great to be here." And it just shows the very problematic situation that it was so superficial. And Dirk Grubner compares it then with the Austrian sort of the year of remembering various anniversaries in 2018. It's kind of like talking about 1918, 1938, and the problematic situation with the then populist government in Austria that is also instrumentalizing this memory, as well as the Trump administration did.
Yes, and for all the problem-oriented analyses that the volume brings together along the lines of historical continuations and ruptures, along the lines of racism sort of regenerated in the Trump era. The last word, the very last word of the volume is hopeful. And this is the last line in your interview, Miriam, with Khaled Muhammad. and so I was struck by this ending that seems to open up sort of a perspective past those 4 years. And I think Khaled Muhammad also gives us some idea of why he is hopeful. He, at the point of this interview, he was hopeful about the elections. He was hopeful about increasing mobilization of an American electorate. And he was hopeful about a new president. So I thought that was interesting also to note as a form of closure. Now, we have a question that we can take up, and also I want to take this opportunity to also ask our audience to send us questions, post questions. The question that we have right now is taking up this idea of a toxic masculinity and any kind of tendency that we would want to predict for the next 4 years under Biden, and in what way can there be a change? I think Miriam, you pointed out that like the very habitus of Biden is not sort of the toxic masculinity kind, but he seems much more fragile and much more introverted in terms of his appearances. Would you like to pick up this question? Oh, yeah, Stephanie, would you like to pick up this question? With regard?
Well, I can start, and then Miriam and Noam can continue. I think, yes, maybe Biden is a different image, but I think to have a woman as vice president and a person of color as such, I mean, this is enough to fuel, you know, this what the question calls toxic masculinity. But the strange thing is, it's a toxic masculinity that is, you know, has a self-image of being overwhelmed all the time. You know, it's like if you read these texts that Christoph Kerr presents, it's like, you know, this feeling of being threatened, of being the victim, of being overpowered. I mean, it's toxic in its praxis, of course. But in the self-image, it's a strange mixture. And I think it's this mixture which makes it so difficult to grasp and so dangerous and so very difficult to predict what will happen. I mean, we are historians, we don't predict anything. But so I think it's very difficult to assess. But apparently it's a big mover, definitely.
I think that one of the interesting questions now is what will happen in 4 years. I think that then we would be able to see what happened with all this toxic masculinity that is widespread out there, and the fact that it's not in the White House, or supposedly or hopefully will not be in the White House anymore after January 20. It is still, the seed has been sown, no? And there is still many frustrated white male with problems or which are in the midst of the crisis in masculinity, and we're not over it. And I think this is part of the work that has to be done now from the side of the Democrat. Is not only like winning the White House or winning the election is not is not the goal, but it's only the first step in the very delicate work of unarming this dangerous seed, or this dangerous plant that is growing there in the Midwest, or anywhere between the two coasts. No?
Can I just join in just a second? I like this word unarming, because I was a bit desperate of reading about healing and healing and healing. And I think it's not so much about healing in the first place. You know, it's not an organism. It's about unarming and about making institutions strong again. I think this is the first, so the healing discourse was driving me a little bit crazy. So thank you. Now I will talk about unarming. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the healing is just another. It's sticking to this medical discourse. No, it's still, we have a disease we have to heal, and this is just using the same language. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and there's a big job for Joe Biden. There are different images that we need. I remember in 2016, one of the things that struck me is that there were news reports about kids that, you know, little boys who would sort of kind of like harass little girls and say like, well, if the president can, why can't I? And these kinds of things will hopefully change if there is a president who stands for decency, who stands for a different set of values. But this is just one thing that needs to be repaired or changed or taken seriously again. There is, of course, the big problem that the Democrats have, or liberals have made many mistakes in the past 20, 30, 40 years. America has had a very sort of well-functioning social system that was slowly, you know, turned into a completely dysfunctional body, and there are a lot of people who see no perspective for themselves, and there are a lot of towns in the Midwest that have not seen any change in a long time, and the only change that they have seen is growing poverty and the opioid crisis. So there's a lot of work to be done on the institutional level, of course, and all the damage this administration has been doing. But there's, of course, a lot of things that need to be addressed to cross this divide, because the problem was, of course, already 4 years ago, and this was not something that happened with Trump, because Trump is a symptom. He's not the problem. I'm sorry, I'm again with the medical metaphors, but the problem is much deeper. And the problem is, of course, that there was a growing divide for a very long time. And one of the experiences in the Midwest was that people on either side of the divide can hardly talk to each other because they don't even use the same terms. They don't even use the same words, even if they talk about the same things. Mm-hmm. And this is a problem that we see in many places, and not just America. We see it in France and we see it in Germany. And I think this is something we all need to address. And there's a big job we all have to do, also as academics.
I have just a very short postscriptum again to this. I think we have to talk about economy and social inequality. I mean, even in our book, we talk about anti-Semitism and racism, which is more cultural history or discourse history. And I think the next step would be exactly this.
Mm-hmm. Well, another angle from which to view the current situation is the question of the media. And now we have a question that came in touching upon the media. I think we observed over the past days the ways in which Trump sort of reckoned with his favorite channel, Fox News, and how he also ventured on to suggest one or two other channels one could watch, which would also move his own political discourse further to the right. The question that has come in is to ask about the rumors that have been going around that Trump, in fact, wants to start his own television channel. And can he do that? Can he build his own channel as a platform for nationalist groups and hate speech? And do we think that he would be successful in trying to do so? So it's a big question, but it's also a very specific question. So it's Trump and the media and how he will continue to feed into and feed on media appearances. Yeah. Is anyone?
Very briefly, just very briefly, he wouldn't be the first, well, if you want to call them populist or nihilist or whatever we call this brand of kind of neo-fascist rulers, he wouldn't be the first one who has his own either media channel or newspaper or whatever. He's now a lot referring to Breitbart News, which is of course further to the right and much further to the right. And we have to see in which direction it develops. But the problem is, and again, I just want to refer to Obama's quote, it's very problematic to have any democratic exchange if we try to build it or if the public discourse is built on lies. Because if there's no truth, there's experts are being questioned, scientists are being threatened. Steve Bannon suggested infamously that Fauci and others should be beheaded. Just imagine that this is what he said. What implications does this have? What do people think about science? So there was a Trump voter, she was interviewed before the election, and she was asked what she thinks about the high numbers of COVID death and what does it say about her president? And she says, I don't believe in numbers.
Yeah, it's about the way certain issues are addressed, and then it's also about the way certain issues are ignored, right? I mean, Trump, I think, for much of the last weeks actually ignored Corona as a topic, period. He did not address it at all, as if it wasn't there. And I think that's another way that this kind of critical discourse is eroded. Yeah. Noam, you wanted to?
Yes, I wanted to say that I think that the idea to have an on channel, TV channel or media channel, seems to me like a refuge. No, it's a place to hide in, to talk to people who are convinced anyway. While these have worked very successfully in smaller countries, having a media, I think that the United States of America is too wide, too big and too diverse in that sense, in order to be able to control the discourse with one channel. So I think that this is while it seems to be a threatening idea, I'm optimistic there in the sense that I think that the other example that I can think about are taking place in a much smaller societies, which are still also very, in a way, ordered according to a national structure, no? In which it is easier to do that. But I'm afraid, or I'm happy, that in the United States, I don't think that this would happen so easily.
Well, it was amazing to see how many followers could be accrued via media channels and also via social media. Of course, that would be a whole other ball game, I guess. Yeah, we have maybe time for one last question, and I want to pick it up from our chat. So it was mentioned before, I think, Noam, you mentioned that kids have been growing up for the past 4 years in an environment of hate speech and bullying, lies, fake news. And so the question is building on this to ask, how will this even affect young people? How will this affect growing up in the United States, having grown up for the past 4 years in this atmosphere? What impact will this have on issues of racism and anti-Semitism? Any thoughts? Noam,
I think that this is where this is the major challenge here. Mm-hmm. And now I really think so. So I think that beside the political, we usually we read the newspapers and we think about the big issues and the policymakers. But I think that we have to take care now of the policymakers of tomorrow, and not only in the United States, but everywhere. Because I think this atmosphere, or this sign of our times is affecting children or younger generation everywhere. And we have to work there in order to fight even these tendencies or the fear that that they lead children to live in. No, so again, maybe unarm those negative feelings, but to deal with this buds of frustrated masculinity. No. But also, but we have to do it through the system. No? The institutions have to, and it's also a financial question, and so on and so forth. And to the fear, we have to add the corona pandemic, which is also affecting a whole generation. So I think that our time is challenging from both fronts, politically and in the medicine way, which is, I think, also a recurring motive here in the volume and this evening. But I think they go hand in hand at the moment. And I see it as one of the major challenges now, also in our work at university, but also teachers in school and every type of education institute.
Yeah, it's nationalism and the pandemic together, which is really incredibly difficult for a younger generation. And then it's, of course, climate change, which has been sort of erased from any policy making in the United States. And the big hope is, of course, that there will be a Green New Deal and that Joe Biden will change this as soon as possible. But I think that also Biden in this situation is always sort of looking inward because there are so many problems. But the big issues that we are facing, apart from the national issues that we're all dealing with in Germany, in France, in the United States, are international, can only be solved on an international level. And now it's suddenly China that wants to take the lead in climate change, fighting climate change. And the question is, what role will the United States play? Of course, Americans complain, and there is even in magazines like Politico, you can read now these accusations, sort of like and this worrying. The United States was in charge of Pax Americana worldwide and paid for that, and Germans should pay for their own self-defense. Yes, of course, yeah, I agree, but there are big issues at stake now that can only be solved in an international context. And I think that will be a huge challenge. And we have to see what role America will play in this new situation that we are more and more entering with problems that can only be solved in an international context. And with the growing problem that there are governments who refuse to think internationally, who argue only on a national basis.
Yeah, we've had a lot of different metaphors tonight to sort of articulate some sort of analysis, the healing, the disarming. One of the metaphors that I've seen frequently also in the covering the elections and the end of the Trump presidency is this idea of a hostage situation or a hostage crisis coming to an end. and so being released from a hostage situation, I think this is how many people have been articulating their situation right now. And so maybe young people, older people, kids and grown-ups, I think will have to work through this I don't know, post-traumatic stress of the last presidency, and preferably in multilateral world. So,
if I may add one word to that, I think that we also are not allowed to forget that almost 50% of Americans have the feeling that now they're entering a situation of being hostage. Mm-hmm. That is, our relief is only our relief in that sense, but we are not, I think that it's dangerous to ignore the worries of the other side now at the moment as we enter this new phase. Yes. And this would be also what will define the next 4 years and beyond, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I mentioned this in the beginning, right? 70 million people have voted for Trump. And these are the people that President Biden will have to reach out to as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. First to disarm them and then to reach out. Exactly. My famous last words.
Complicated procedure of therapy involving all kinds of different measures. So, yeah, so the last 4 years have been grim in many ways. The publication that we have presented to you attests to this. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for sharing your questions and your thoughts. And I want to say goodbye now.
But may I add one last word? I'm sorry. There's one person I forgot to thank, and I would like to do that before we end this evening. And this is Jasmin Falk, without whom the volume wouldn't been published. I think not timely, but probably not at all. And I think we all owe her a big thank you. And I wanted to mention that before we say goodbye. So
yes,
thank you.
I want to fully support that. Thank you, Jasmin Falk, for your editorial help in putting the book out. Okay, then I say good night. Goodbye. See you soon at the NS Documentation Centre or at the Amerikahaus whenever we will have opportunities again to actually meet. Bye-bye. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.